In the winter of 1887, on the frozen shoulder of the Madison River, where it bent through the Gallatin country of Montana Territory, a woman of 29 stood ankle-deep in snow and watched four men laugh at her from the warmth of a saloon porch. She had paid $2 for a thing that no one else would touch. It lay, half swallowed in the river ice, a strong box of riveted iron the size of a feed trough, dark as a drowned stove, and the man who sold it to her had grinned the whole while, certain he had cheated a fool. Her name was Della Ward. She had a borrowed sledge, a bar of cold steel, and the hands her father had trained. And she meant to take that box out of the ice before the light failed. The men called to her. One asked whether she planned to thaw it with her own breath. Another said the only thing inside a box left 30 years in the river would be river. And they all laughed again, the easy laughter of men who had never been wrong in a way that cost them anything. Della did not answer. She had learned long ago that an answer was a kind of payment, and she did not owe these men a coin. She set the edge of her bar against the rime, where the iron met the frozen water, and she began to work. You may have stood once where Della stood, holding a thing the world had told you was worthless, knowing in your hands that it was not. Stay with her a while. What she found inside that box would unmake a man who had never once doubted himself, and she would not raise her voice to do it. The box had come up at the territorial sale that morning, the last lot of a clearing auction held to settle the affairs of the defunct Three Forks Freight and Transfer Company, a concern that had gone under so long ago that few in the room remembered it had ever run a wagon. There were harness sets and a broken safe and a stack of waybills nobody bid on, and at the end the auctioneer had pointed his cane at the river and said the company's old Strongbox was out there in the ice if anyone wanted to dig it. $2, and you carried the trouble home yourself. The room had laughed. Then, too, Della had raised her hand. She had not raised it on a whim. She had been watching that box for 3 days, from the time the auction was posted, walking out to the riverbank in the gray cold and crouching beside the iron and reading it the way her father had taught her to read iron. The hinges were forged, not cast. The seams were double riveted. The lock plate was a Hewitt & Sons pattern from before the war, the kind built to be drilled rather than picked, the kind men did not waste on an empty box. A company did not sink that much craft into a container it meant to leave empty in a river. Whatever Three Forks had put inside it, they had meant for it to stay. Della Ward had grown up under the hands of a locksmith. Her father, Amos, had kept a shop in Helena until the lung sickness took him the spring she turned 26, and in the years before that he had taught her every tumbler and ward and shimmed bolt that passed across his bench. He had taught her without softness and without doubt, the same way he taught the boys who apprenticed and then left to open shops of their own, because no bank would credit a woman with a trade. When Amos died, he left her his tools and nothing else, and the tools were enough, because they were the part of him that did not die. She carried them in a brown leather satchel that had gone the color of a saddle, and she could name each one in the dark. The frontier did not credit her either. She had come down to the Gallatin country looking for work that did not exist, a woman who could open a locked thing in a country full of men who would rather break it. She had slept in a boarding house run by a widow named Saul, who took her last good dollars and asked no questions, and she had eaten thin and waited for a thing to turn. The strong box in the ice was the thing. She had known it the moment she saw the lock plate. The trouble was getting it out before someone with more money and less patience understood what she understood. The river had her box in a grip that did not mean to let go. 30 years of freeze and thaw had welded the iron into a shelf of ice the color of a bruise, peacock blue where the cold light caught it, milk white where the snow had packed. Della did not fight the ice. Her father had taught her that you never fight a material. You learn its grain and you work along it. And ice had a grain like anything else. She chipped a channel around the box rather than under it, a hand's width at a time, clearing the rime so the low sun could find the iron and lend her its small warmth. The iron, once bared, drank the light and held it, and where it warmed it loosened, and where it loosened she drove her bar. The men on the porch lost interest by the second hour. Cold has a way of curing an audience. By the time the light went amber and long across the snow, Della was alone with the box, and the sound of her own breath, and the small dry music of steel on ice. She worked until she could not feel her fingers, and then she wrapped them in wool and worked again. When the dark came down, she walked back to the Widow Sol's and slept like a dropped tool and was on the river again before the sun. It took her 3 days to free the box. This is the part the men never see, the part that is only labor, the days that do not fit into a story told in a saloon. She broke the handle of the borrowed sledge on the second day and walked 2 miles to buy another. She wore through the leather of her gloves and bound her palms in strips of flannel. The cold worked against her in a way that had nothing to do with malice and everything to do with patience, for the river had had 30 winters to set its grip, and she had only her arms and the slow gift of the afternoon sun. Each morning the channel she had cut the day before had frozen, part way shut again, a skin of new ice across her work, and each morning she chipped it clear and started where she had stopped, and the men who passed on the road told one another the woman was simple, to keep at a thing the river so plainly did not mean to give up. She kept at it because her father had taught her the difference between a thing that resists and a thing that refuses, and ice only resists. A refusal you respect and you walk away from, a resistance you outlast. She set small fires of driftwood against the iron in the late afternoons, not to melt the box, which no fire she could build would do, but to warm the metal a few degrees, so the bond between iron and ice would weaken at the seam. And then she drove her bar into the weakened seam, while the warmth held a hand's width gained before the cold took it back. It was arithmetic done with the whole body. It was the kind of work that has no audience because there is nothing in it to watch, only a woman and a bar, and the same motion repeated until the light goes. On the third afternoon the box came loose all at once, the way a tooth finally lets go, and the weight of it nearly took her down into the channel she had cut. She braced and held. Then she sat in the snow with her bound hands shaking and looked at the thing she had paid $2 for, free of the river at last, and she did not yet know that it would cost her far more than $2 to carry what was inside. She did not open it on the river. A thing like that you do not open in the cold and the wet, with your hands ruined and the light failing. She hired a man named Cobb who owned a stone boat and a patient mule, and for 50 cents he dragged the box up the bank and through the edge of town to the lean-to behind the Widow Sol's, and the whole way the men who had laughed came out to watch the fool haul her river trash home. Cobb said little. When he had the box settled on the dirt floor of the lean-to, he looked at the lock plate a long moment, and then he looked at Della. "Hewitt and Sons," he said. "My uncle freighted for an outfit that used those. They did not put them on empty boxes." "No," Della said, "they did not." Cobb nodded slowly, as if a thing he had half suspected had come clear. He was an old man, weathered down to gristle and good sense, and he had been on the Gallatin since before there was a town to speak of. He said he had hauled for Three Forks himself in his younger days, the winter of '56, when the company ran gold and bank paper between the camps and the river landings, and he said it the way a man says a thing he has not let himself remember in a long while. Then he said he would come back in the morning if she did not mind, because he had a notion about that box, and he wanted to see whether he was right. Della told him the morning would be welcome. She had not asked for help. She had learned, though, that the difference between a stubborn woman and a foolish one was knowing which help to take, and Cobb's hands were old, but they were honest, and his memory was older than the town. That night alone she cleaned the lock by lantern light. The plate was caked with rust and river silt, and she worked it with a soft brush and a rag and a little oil from her satchel until the keyhole showed clear. She did not try to open it yet. Her father had taught her that you study a lock before you touch it, that the worst thing a smith can do is hurry, because a lock that has waited 30 years can wait one more night, and a smith who hurries leaves a scar. So she studied. She read the wards by the feel of a pick, laid gentle against them, the way a doctor reads a pulse, and what she felt told her the mechanism was a 6-lever deadbolt, of a make her father had owned the cutaway model of a model he had made her open blindfolded until her hands knew it better than her eyes. She had opened that lock 1,000 times in his shop. She had never once opened it on a box dragged from a river with a secret 30 years old inside. What she did not know, what she could not know on that first night, was that the box she had pried from the ice belonged to a story the whole valley had agreed to forget, and that the agreeing had made one man very rich. His name was Harlan Vance, and in the winter of 1887 he owned the Gallatin Valley Bank, 3,000 acres of bottomland, and the quiet respect of every man who owed him money, which was nearly every man in the country. He had come into his money young, in the years just after the war, and the story he told of it was a story of thrift and foresight and a few good purchases of land that fools had let go cheap. It was a good story. He had told it for 30 years, and it had hardened into history. First, he sat on the bank board and the Territorial Road Commission and the committee that decided where the new spur line would run, and he had never in 3 decades met a thing he could not buy or wait out or quietly bury. He did not know yet that a woman had pulled a box out of the river. When he learned it, he would not at first understand why the news made the back of his neck go cold. In the morning Cobb came as he had promised, and he brought a younger woman with him, his granddaughter, a sharp-eyed girl of perhaps 19 named Tessa, who kept the books for the feed store and could read a ledger faster than any man in town. Cobb said she ought to be there. He did not say why, only that if his notion was right, there would be papers in that box, and papers wanted reading by someone who understood them. Della looked at the girl, and the girl looked back at her without the pity Della had come to expect, with only a plain and steady curiosity, and Della decided she liked her. Then Della knelt at the box and set her father's tools out on a clean cloth in the order she always used, and she began. The opening took the better part of the morning. The lock was sound, but the rust had found its way into the works, and she had to flush it and oil it and work each lever, free of the grit that 30 years of river had packed around it. She talked to no one while she worked. Cobb sat on an upturned crate and watched, and the girl Tessa stood by the door with her arms folded, and, outside the snow, came down soft and steady. Della felt the first lever give and then the second, and a stillness came over her that her father would have recognized, the stillness of a mind narrowed to the width of a keyway. Her father had a saying about that stillness. He said a lock did not open for the hand, it opened for the patience, and that any man too proud to be patient would die, never having opened the best of what was shut to him. She felt the third lever and the fourth. The fifth lever fought her for an hour. She did not force it. To force it would have sheared the works and turned the box into a thing she would have to drill, and drilling would have taken days and ruined whatever lay against the inside of the plate. So she waited on the fifth lever the way you wait on a frightened animal, easing and releasing, until the rust let go its last grain and the lever rose. The six came easy after that, the way the last of a thing often does. Della felt the bolt draw back under her hand, a long iron sigh, 30 years in the holding, and she sat back on her heels and let out a breath of her own. "It is open," she said. She did not lift the lid at once. She looked at Cobb, and Cobb looked at the box, and neither of them moved for a moment, because some doors you do not hurry through. Then Della worked her fingers under the lip of the lid and lifted, and the hinges that her father's kind of craft had forged turned still true after 30 years, and the cold air that had been sealed inside since before the town had a name came up into the lean-to and touched their faces. It smelled of iron and old paper, and something faintly sweet that was the smell of time itself. Della looked into the box, and Della went silent. She did not speak, because what lay in the box rearranged the world she had been standing in, and a person needs a moment to find her feet on new ground. On top, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff as bark, lay a banded stack of banknotes, territorial scrip and federal paper both, more money than Della had seen in her life, enough to make a body's breath catch. The money was not the thing that silenced her. Under the money lay a leather portfolio, and inside the portfolio lay the true cargo of the box. The thing Three Forks had built that lock to keep, and it was paper of a different kind. It was a ledger and a sheaf of signed deposit receipts and a bundle of letters, and the first name Della's eye fell on, written in a clerk's careful hand across the top of the ledger, was a name the whole valley knew. The ledger belonged to the Three Forks Company, and it recorded, in the patient daily hand of a dead bookkeeper, every consignment of gold and bank paper the company had carried in the autumn and winter of 1856. And against one entry, the largest entry, the entry that recorded a shipment of $40,000 in deposits gathered from the camps along the upper river and bound for the bank at the landing, there was a notation in a different hand, a note added later, a note that named the man. When the company foundered and the depositors came asking that no such shipment had ever reached him, the name on the receipt, signed in a young man's bold hand, was Harlan Vance. Cobb read it over her shoulder and made a sound low in his throat. He had been a young man in '56. He remembered the winter the company went under, he said, and he remembered the families that lost everything they had dug out of the ground because the deposits they had been promised were safe had simply vanished into a failed company's accounts. And he remembered that Harlan Vance had been a clerk for Three Forks before he was anything else. A clever young clerk who left the company just before it failed and turned up a year later with money enough to start a bank. Everyone had assumed he was lucky. Everyone had assumed wrong. Tessa came from the doorway then and knelt and read the ledger with the quick certainty of someone who spent her days inside columns of figures, and when she lifted her head, her face had changed. She said the receipts were real. She said the hand that signed them was the same hand that signed the bank notices posted in the feed store every quarter. She would know it anywhere, the particular way the man crossed his capital letters. She said the $40,000 had never been a failure of the company at all. It had been a theft, and the thief had let the company take the blame, and the families who lost their deposits had spent 30 years believing they had simply been unlucky in their choice of where to put their gold. Della sat with the ledger in her lap and understood several things at once. She understood why the company had built so good a lock. The bookkeeper, whoever he had been, had known what Vance had done, and he had gathered the proof and he had locked it in the company's Strongbox along with the money that remained, and then the company had foundered, and the bookkeeper had died or fled, and the box had gone into the river with the wreckage of the last failed crossing. And the proof had waited 30 years in the ice for a hand that knew how to open it. She understood that the $2 she had paid was the smallest price ever set on the largest truth in the valley. And she understood that she now held in her ruined hands the power to undo a man who owned half the county, and that the holding of it was dangerous. She told Cobb and Tessa to say nothing. Not from fear, though there was reason for fear, but because she had learned from her father that you do not announce a thing before you understand it, and she did not yet understand what justice for a 30-year-old theft could even look like. The bookkeeper was dead, the company was dust. Most of the depositors were surely dead, too. A truth this old did not have an obvious door, and Della meant to study it the way she studied a lock, before she touched it. That night she did not sleep. She sat with the ledger by lantern light, and she read every entry, and the dead bookkeeper's careful hand told her the whole of it. His name had been Josiah Penn. He had been the company's senior clerk, and he had trusted the young man Vance. and the ledger held a slow record of his trust curdling into certainty as the deposits he had logged as received failed to appear in the company's accounts at the landing. There were the letters, too, drafts of letters Penn had written and not sent, addressed to the territorial marshal and to the bank examiner, each one laying out what he had found and each one unsent, because Della understood a clerk's word against a clever man's was worth nothing, and Penn had known it, and he had done the only thing a careful man could do. He had gathered the proof that did not depend on his word. He had locked it away. He had trusted the iron to outlast the lie. Among the letters was one Penn had finished, but never had the chance to send, and it was addressed to no official at all. It was addressed to the depositors, to the families of the Upper River, and in it Penn told them plainly that their money had not been lost but stolen, and he named the man, and he begged their forgiveness for not having protected what they entrusted to the company, and he wrote that he had set aside what he could recover so that someday, if the truth ever came to light, there might be at least the beginning of a restoration. The set-aside was the banded money in the box, $11,000 that Penn had managed to hold back from the wreck, all that remained of a stolen fortune, saved against a day he did not live to see. Della read that letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, and she sat a long while in the cold, and what settled in her was not anger, though she had cause for anger. What settled in her was the particular grave resolve of a person who has been handed a dead man's unfinished work and has decided to finish it. She did not go to the marshal. A truth, this old, brought by a woman no one credited, against a man who owned the marshal's mortgage, would have died in the telling. She went instead to the one authority that even Harlan Vance could not buy, which was the truth itself, plainly laid out where everyone could see it and no one could unsee it. She went to Tessa, who kept the feed store books and knew every family on the Upper River by the accounts they ran, and together over the following week they made a list. They found the descendants. The Hollises, whose grandfather had lost the diggings money meant to carry his family through the winter and had died the poorer for it. The widow, Aldous, whose husband's people had put their whole stake into a Three Forks deposit and never seen it again. The Reyes family down the valley, and the 2 Boone brothers, and a dozen more, the children and grandchildren of people who had spent 30 years believing themselves merely unlucky, are. Cobb went with her to the first of them because an old man known in the country could open a door that a strange woman could not. They sat in the Hollis kitchen, and Della laid the ledger on the table and turned it to the entry and let the dead clerk's hand say what she had come to say. The kitchen was warm and close, a kettle ticking on the stove, a child's boots drying by the firebox, and into that ordinary warmth Della set a 30-year-old theft as plainly as she would set down a tool. She did not soften it, and she did not sharpen it. She turned the ledger so the old man could read it right side up, and she put her finger beside the entry that named the loss, and she waited. The old man Hollis, who was a boy of 8 the winter, his father lost everything, put on his spectacles and read the entry and read the receipt, with Vance's name signed bold across it, and his hands began to shake, and he said in a voice gone thin that his father had gone to his grave calling himself a fool for trusting the company, and that he had believed his father a fool too, all his life, and now he knew his father had not been a fool. He had been robbed. There is a particular grief in learning that a shame you carried for 30 years was never yours to carry. Hollis wept, not for the money, he said, but for his father, who had died ashamed of a thing that was no fault of his. Cobb sat with him while he wept and said nothing, which was the right thing to say, and Della folded her hands and waited, because she had learned that a person handed a truth this heavy, needed room to set it down. When Hollis had gathered himself, he asked her what she wanted of him, whether there was money to be paid or papers to be signed, and Della told him plainly that she wanted nothing of him, only that he know the truth and carry it to whoever else of the old family still lived. The asking, she said, would have to come from the families themselves, all of them together, because one voice the valley could ignore, and a dozen it could not. Hollis took off his spectacles and looked at her a long moment and said he would carry it. He said it the way a man takes up a thing he has been waiting his whole life to be strong enough to lift. Word moved through the valley the way water moves through ice. Slow, and then all at once. Della did not spread it. The family spread it, each one carrying the truth to the next, and within a fortnight there was not a soul on the upper river who did not know that the old Three Forks money had not been lost but stolen, and that the proof had come out of the river in an iron box, and that the name on the proof was Harlan Vance. Vance heard it last, as the guilty often do, because the people around a powerful man learn to keep hard news from him until it cannot be kept. When it reached him, he did the thing such men always do first. He called it a lie. He called the ledger a forgery, and the woman who found it a swindler, and the whole story the invention of people who envied his success and wanted to pull him down. He had 30 years of being believed behind him, and for a few days the weight of that history held. Men who owed him money found reasons to doubt the story. The newspaper in the county seat, which carried his advertisements, printed nothing. A forged ledger, though, is a thing that can be examined, and the demand to examine it was the error that certainty always makes. He demanded the ledger be brought forward and proven false, certain that the demand itself would end the matter, certain that no one would dare. He did not understand that the woman who held it had been waiting precisely for him to ask. Della brought the ledger and the receipts and Penn's letters to the territorial bank examiner, a man Vance did not own because the man answered to Helena and not to the Gallatin, and she brought Tessa to testify to the hand, and she brought Cobb to testify that he had hauled for Three Forks and remembered the lost shipment, with its Hewitt and Sons lock and its company markings, a thing that could not be forged because it had lain 30 years in a river that everyone in the valley had watched freeze and thaw across 3 decades. The examiner studied the receipts against the bank's own records, the loan notices, and the deposit slips bearing Vance's signature, going back years. He studied the way the man crossed his capital letters, the particular weight of the downstroke, the small habits a hand cannot disguise across 30 years of signing. He compared the hand on the stolen receipt to the hand on a note Vance had signed the previous spring. They were the same hand. They were beyond any question the same hand. The examiner was a careful man, and he said so carefully. But careful words about a matter like that travel fast and land hard. Harlan Vance was never arrested in a dramatic scene, never confronted across a room, never made to stand and answer. That is not how such men fall. He simply began to dissolve the way a thing dissolves when the ground beneath it is found to be false. The bank board, who could read which way the territory was turning, asked for his resignation. The road commission found it no longer needed him. The men who had owed him money and feared him discovered that a man proven a thief is owed nothing, and the respect that had armored him for 30 years fell away in a season, and what was left was an old man in a big empty house who had built his whole life on a stolen $40,000 and was now known by every soul in the valley for exactly what he was. He left the country before the next winter. No one knew where he went, and no one troubled to find out. He had become, at last, the thing he had spent 30 years making other men become. He had become someone the valley had agreed to forget. Della did not gloat. When men asked her, in the weeks after, whether it pleased her to have brought down the great Harlan Vance, she said she had not brought him down. The box had. She had only opened it. She said it plainly, and she meant it plainly, and the men who had laughed at her on the saloon porch in December found they had nothing to say to her now, and some of them, the better ones, came and said so, awkwardly hat in hand, that they had been wrong to laugh. Della took their apologies the way she took everything, without heat and without triumph. She had not done the work to be proven right. She had done it because there was a thing shut that ought to be open, and she had the hands to open it. The $11,000 that Josiah Penn had saved against a day he did not live to see, Della did not keep. She might have. There was no law that compelled her to give up money she had found in a box she had lawfully bought for $2. And there were men who told her she was a fool not to keep it, the same men, more or less, who had called her a fool for buying the box. The money had a letter wrapped around it, though, and the letter named whom it belonged to, and Della had read that letter 3 times in the cold and had decided to finish the dead man's work the way he had meant it to be finished. With Tessa's careful figuring, the money was divided among the descendants of the families on Penn's list, each share set against the loss recorded in the ledger, restitution 30 years late and far from whole, but real, and given with a dead clerk's apology, folded into every envelope. It did not make the families rich. $11,000 spread across a dozen families and 3 decades does not undo a ruin. The old man Hollis, though, when Della put his family's share in his hands along with a copy of Penn's letter, did not look at the money. He looked at the letter, at the place where the dead clerk had written that the loss was no fault of the depositors, and he held it the way a man holds a thing he has waited his whole life to be given, and he said his father could rest now, and so could he. That was the restitution that mattered. The money was only money. The thing that had been stolen and now returned was a good name, and you cannot put a good name in a bank, but a man can carry it to his grave, and Hollis would, quote, Della Ward stayed in the Gallatin country. The valley that had laughed at her found rather suddenly that it had urgent need of a locksmith, and the work that had not existed for a woman in December existed for her by spring, because a person who could open the unopenable was a person worth crediting, and a person who could be trusted with what she found inside was rarer still and worth more. She took the lean-to behind the widow Saul's and made it a shop, and she hung her father's tools on the wall in the order she had always kept them, and she set the iron strongbox in the corner by the door, emptied now of everything but its history, and she did not sell it, though she was offered good money for it more than once. She kept it, because it was the second teacher she had ever had. Her father had taught her the trade. The box had taught her what the trade was for. On the morning the last of the restitution was paid out, the old man Cobb came by the shop with his granddaughter Tessa, who had taken to helping Della with the accounts and the reading of documents that came her way, and the 3 of them stood a while in the cold doorway and looked at the box in the corner with the low winter light coming across it. Cobb said it was a strange thing that so much wrong could lie so long under so much ice and wait so patiently for the right hands. Della said her father had told her once that iron keeps what it is given faithfully, without judgment, for as long as it is asked to keep it, and that this was the whole of its virtue and the whole of its danger, that it would as soon keep a lie as a truth, and the only question that ever mattered was whose hands came at last to open it. Tessa asked her whether she was ever afraid in those days, in December, working alone on the river with the men laughing, that the box would hold nothing at all, that she had spent her last dollars and her ruined hands on river trash after all. Della considered the question the way she considered everything, without hurry. She said she had not been afraid of that. She said a good lock told you the truth about itself before you ever opened it, that no company spent that craft on an empty box, and that her father had taught her to trust the iron over the laughter every time. Then she said the only thing she had been afraid of was that she would not be equal to whatever the box held, that her hands would fail at the work, that the thing would stay shut against her, after all. She had not been afraid of the truth. She had only been afraid of not being good enough to reach it. She had been good enough. The winters that followed were long, as winters in that country always are, and Della Ward grew old in the Gallatin, and the shop behind the widow Saul's became a fixture of the town. The place you brought a thing that would not open, the place you brought a thing you needed kept. She trained 2 apprentices in her years, a girl and a boy, both, and she trained them the way her father had trained her, without softness and without doubt, and she made them open the cutaway lock blindfolded until their hands knew it better than their eyes. She told them the trade was patience before it was anything else. She told them a lock opened for the patience and not the hand. And once to each of them, when she judged them ready to understand it, she told them the story of the box in the corner, the $2 and the ice, and the laughter, and the dead clerk's faithful hand, and the 30 years a truth had waited for someone willing to do the cold work of reaching it. The box stayed in the corner by the door all her life. Children who came into the shop with their parents would ask about it, the great dark iron thing with its old company markings, and Ella would let them put their small hands on the cold lid and feel the forged hinges that still turned true, and she would tell them only that it had once held something a man had tried to hide forever, and that forever was shorter than the man had thought. She did not tell the children the whole of it. Some truths want a grown understanding. She let them feel the iron, though, because she believed that a hand remembers what the ear forgets, and she wanted them to carry, even without knowing why, the simple fact of a cold and patient thing that had kept faith with a truth until the right hands came. On the last morning of her life, many years on, an old woman in a shop full of the smell of oil and iron, Della Ward sat in her chair by the stove with the low light coming across the box in the corner, the same low amber light that had come across it the morning the restitution was paid, and she rested her hands, which had done so much patient work. In her lap, the box sat where it had always sat. The hinges would still turn true. And anyone who had stood in that doorway and looked from the woman to the iron and back would have understood, without a word said, that the two of them had kept faith with each other to the end. The locksmith and the box she had pulled from the ice, the woman no one had credited, and the truth no one had wanted. Both of them waiting all those years ago in the cold for the patience that finally came. Have you ever held in your own hands a thing the world told you was worthless and known better, and been proven right by your own quiet work? Tell me about it if you would. And if this story stayed with you, there is another like it waiting, of a woman, and a sealed thing, and a truth that outlasted the lie, and I will tell it to you next.